Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We will take just a few short minutes to let other people hop on before we begin the webinar. Okay, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us once again. We really appreciate it. Today, we're going to hear Dr. Candace Peterson talk about logic models, so that's really awesome. We're very excited to have her. However, before we get started, I'd like to go just through a few housekeeping things. So as you guys have joined us, you guys are automatically muted, which is great. So you guys don't have to worry if your phone rings or anything like that. We'll be good to go. The way that we want you guys, and we encourage you to send in questions. There will be a few points throughout the webinar where Dr. Peterson will ask for your feedback, and where you'll go for that will be the questions spot on the control panel that's on the right of your screen. So if you have a question throughout, feel free to share it with us. We also will have some time at the end for questions as well. If you think of something and you want to kind of wait till the end, that's fine too. And like I said, we encourage you to use that, and Dr. Peterson will be asking for some feedback, and that's what you'll use as well as the question little section. Also, there will be a poll that takes place through the webinar, so that will come up on your screen just so you're aware. That will be coming up, a poll for you guys to answer as well. Please respond to that when it comes. And also, Dr. Peterson has sent me 2 handouts to send to you guys after the webinar, so once the webinar is over, I will send all attendees those handouts as well. All right, now I would like to introduce our presenter. Dr. Candace Peterson grew up in the rural Midwest, and she has worked in the field of substance abuse prevention for a lot of years now. Her work has been done at many different levels, such as university, local, state, and national. And she has received her master's degree in public policy and administration and in adult education. And Dr. Peterson earned her doctorate in adult education at the University of Wisconsin. So thank you guys for joining us once again, and now I will hand it over to Dr. Candace Peterson.
Okay, good morning, everybody. This is Candace Peterson. I'm so glad that you can join us today. And I want to check with everybody, Emma, including you, that you can see my screen.
Yep, we are looking good. I see your title screen, your title slide.
Okay, great. Just wanted to check in on the logistics there. I am interested in hearing from you guys a little bit about, a little bit about what your role is in prevention in your own setting. So I'm going to invite you here to type into the question box and just tell us what your role is on your campus or university. And you can go into the question box to do that. So please let us see what you're doing. What is your role?
Yep, so if you guys could utilize that question little box and respond to the question.
Okay, great. I'm seeing Margot. Hi, Margot, the coordinator with the statewide coalition for prevention. How about some of the rest of you? Marijuana and health educator at Loyola. Not currently on the campus. Let's see, consulting and volunteering overseas. Wow. Anybody else besides Star, Mary, Margot? Anybody else want to type into the chat box or the question box and let us know what you're doing? A military spouse. That's a person that's the BRFSS state coordinator for the state of Arkansas. Hi, Mallory. Anybody else want to type in? Let us know what you're doing. All right, well, we've got people with many different roles here joining us today, and I am pretty confident that whatever your role is with prevention in your setting, that this is going to be pertinent to you. As Emma said a few minutes ago, if you have questions while we're going through the presentation, I invite you to type into the question box and let us know what your question is, and if I can, I will address it at that time. All right, let's get started. The next thing I'd like you to do, I have a little poll for you here. I'm interested in seeing what your first reaction is when you hear the term logic model. And what I'd like you to do on your screen, you should see on your taskbar a poll coming up. And what I'd like you to do is check one of those three boxes. Lovely to use, uncertain, or run the other way. No, do I have to do this? Okay. And we're collecting responses right now. It's interesting to see, and I'll share results with you as soon as we have a few more people clicking on boxes. So it looks right now like we have varied responses. And I'm going to go ahead and close the poll in about 10 seconds. So if you haven't chosen one of those options, please do that now. Okay, now let's see what the results were. And I'm hoping that everyone can see these results off to the right on your screen, on your taskbar. About half of you said, yeah, I love using logic models. And that's, I have to say, a fairly high number. I wasn't expecting that. Usually when I do presentations on logic models, more people are in the yikes or in the no, run the other way box. So about a third of you were like, I'm not sure about logic models. Maybe you're not sure what they are or why they're important. And about 20% said, I am running the other way as soon as I hear that. Okay, thank you for your participation with that. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about what we're going to do today and what we hope to accomplish. And I seem to be having problems with my logic model slide. Hopefully I can get that set up for us again. Geez, I apologize for this, you guys. I'm hoping I can fix this for us. One moment. Okay, great. So the first thing, thank you for your patience with that. The first thing we're going to talk about is what the key elements of a logic model are. Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry that this is happening. The next thing we want to talk about is how you make your logic model logical. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is how do you actually, once you've developed it, how do you use your logic model? Okay, so what we hope to get out of today, what I would hope that you would walk away from today with, are to be able to describe how to develop and use a logic model and how it can benefit you. Next, be able to describe the key elements of a well-constructed logic model. Also, how to check whether your logic model is actually logical, and then how to use the logic model to strengthen your prevention efforts. So first, let's start out by taking a look at what a logic model is. A logic model is a visual way. It's like a way to look at what you're going to do in terms of your actionable plans, your strategies, and maps. Your visual logic model will also depict clear outcomes and explicit steps for solving program problems. The logic model will provide a roadmap highlighting these links that I'm clicking through now. What are your problems? What resources do you have to address those problems? What activities and efforts are you going to do to address your priority problems? What things need to happen before other things? And what are your intended outcomes? The other thing a logic model is really your driver for program planning and evaluation. So I'm going to start by first doing a very short review of the benefits of developing a logic model. So what is the point here? I note please that I've underlined here in this top part of the slide, how does this benefit you? I know many times funders or grant makers or department heads require you to develop a logic model for your prevention efforts. But I want to make the point here that developing a logic model and using it, it's not just an oversight and accountability function, something that you need to do for somebody else. I would like you to consider the following benefits to you. First, it really can provide a way for promoting communication and common understanding about key things around your prevention program. Second, it really helps you clarify what kind of assumptions you're making and what kind of theory you're using to base your efforts on. And third, it really can provide a framework for you for planning, monitoring, reporting progress, and for evaluation. The other thing that is really important about a logic model is that it can really engage stakeholders and build ownership in prevention. Let me say more now about this important but often overlooked aspect of logic models. There's a Sri Lankan saying, we build the road and the road builds us. So what this means really is that logic model is not just a pretty graphic, but it's a way of thinking. So creating logic models in a group or with other people on your staff, other stakeholders, brings the power of consensus and group examination about what you want to have happen, So much of the value in a logic model is really in that process of working together to create and validate and modify the model. The clarity of thinking that occurs from working together to build the model is really critical to the overall success of the program, and critical in building that ownership for your prevention efforts. So the main point here is think about it not just as a product that you're producing, but the process of building that logic model is also of great value. All right, now I'm going to ask you again here, if you could please type some answers into the question box to this question. Just briefly, in what ways have logic model been useful to you in your efforts? So please type now into the question box and give me some examples of how logic models have been beneficial or useful to you. Thanks, Dave. Oh, hi, Dave. I didn't know you were joining us today. Dave Clausen, providing clarity of direction. Yeah, that's a good one, Dave. Thank you. Mary, using a logic model, has used a logic model for alcohol prevention efforts at our university. Margot says it's been helpful for coalition members to identify the best strategies. Another person with us today, determining if a program or effort is still relevant and working, reevaluating the strategic plan. Thanks, Star. Also, Star says, explaining to leadership why something does or does not work. Hi, Amanda. Amanda is saying it's been helpful to best navigate several programs. Anybody else? And I'm sorry if I've missed anything that somebody has commented on here. Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you for those examples. All right. Let's look now at logic model components in a little bit more detail. First, when we're thinking about logic models, basically we're developing a simple image, a straightforward approach. So a visual way of showing what you're doing in a very collapsed way. So you're taking kind of a lot of information and some of it fairly complex, and you're showing how everything is related. It's a picture of how your organization does its work, and a picture often is actually worth 1,000 words. So first we're talking about what is the problem, what are your concerns, and here we're not talking just about use, but we're also talking about consequences of use and risk and protective factors related to use. Of those, then you determine what your priorities, out of all of the possible things you could work on, what are the priorities? And we'll talk about all of these elements in depth. From here, and you've used data here on the left-hand side to determine your problems and what the priorities are. Then you will take stock of resources. So resources as a component means what are we investing to address the problem? What do we have to invest? Human, financial resources, maybe technological. The next thing you're going to be looking at as a component is what strategies, evidence-based programs, practices, policies we are going to do, with whom, how many, when, details like that. And then finally, as a result of our efforts, what results do we expect to get? These could be short-term results, which are typically changes in learning, medium-term results, which are changes in action, behavior, practice, and then the ultimate impact, what conditions do you want to have change? So let's take a look a little bit more closely at these key components. Resources are human, financial resources, staff, volunteers, could be material or equipment, technology, research, and partners. Strategies, evidence-based services, or sometimes called evidence-based practices, policies, programs. This includes thinking about what we do. So evidence-based approaches, what activities, what products, and who we reach. Students, community agencies, departments, are we looking at parents, decision makers, and in what area, geographic area. And then we look at what the short-term results are and what we want our longer-term results to be. So I'm going to break this down and we're going to look at each of these components, resources, strategies, and outcomes in a little bit more detail. Excuse me, starting with the priority problems. So in the logic model process, the very first step is to use data to assess your situation and identify your primary problems of concern. So here, again, think beyond just the rate of use of substances and look more closely at the negative impacts or consequences that occur as the result of consumption. Also consider the modifiable risk factors, which are either risk or protective factors associated with use or with the consequence. Risk and protective factors are also sometimes called intervening variables. A risk factor, just to review for probably most of you, is something that is associated with a higher likelihood of a problem outcome, while a protective factor contributes to a lower likelihood of a problem outcome. When you identify these risk and protective factors, A, they need to be modifiable, but B, and maybe more importantly even, is that these risk and protective factors need to be associated with a consequence of concern. There can be a number of these factors, and using the data available to you, they will be specific to your particular community. And then you want to think about, of all of those potential problems, those potential consequences to focus on, or the risk and protective factors to focus on in your programming, what are the priorities? And again, here you will need to use data to determine priorities. And not only data, but kind of considering changeability. It doesn't do any good to focus on something which you are not, it's not going to be within your power to change. So analyzing political will and changeability must also happen in terms of prioritizing where your efforts will go. I want to emphasize that this step is really critical, using sound data, the most recent that you can get, to inform this part of constructing your logic model. There are some examples of data sources that I have included on a handout that Emma will send to you directly after the webinar. Most of them I think you'll be familiar with, but the handout includes links to those data sources and what kind of data or information you can expect to find in those data sources, and includes things like the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, Monitoring the Future, the National College Health Association, behavioral risk factors, surveillance survey, and the Core Institute. You may also have data available particular to your setting, for example, freshman student surveys or environmental scans or local and campus police data, ambulance data, that kind of thing. So look for that handout with data sources directly after the webinar. So primary problems. In terms of use of substances, according to the most recent Core survey, these are the kinds of things that we're seeing for students in the post-secondary setting. And you can see that there is high numbers of binge drinking, past 30-day alcohol use, underage use, and use of marijuana. In terms of consequences, you, I think, are all aware that as a result of use, we're seeing a lot of very serious consequences. For example, we've got thousands of students between the ages of 18 and 24 that sustain unintentional injuries while they're under the influence of alcohol or some other drug. Assaults occur under the influence. Sexual assaults occur. Unintended pregnancies. Also, we're seeing short-term academic problems, lower retention, in some cases, even death. So you can also see that, in terms of assessing primary problems, you need to look at risk and protective factors that are contributing to use and therefore consequences. There are individual level risk factors and protective factors. They might include biological or psychological characteristics that make people vulnerable to or resilient in the face of behavioral health problems. But individuals don't exist in isolation. They're also engaged in relationships that influence their behaviors. They're members of families. They have close social circle peers. All of these relationships influence their behavior and contribute to their range of experience. There's also the broader campus community and the community in general that influence risk and protective factors. And finally, there are high-risk events that are occurring in your students' lives, and those need to be taken into account too as you're thinking about your primary problems. So as a practitioner, you have to look across all of these contexts to address the constellation of factors that influence both individuals and your population in general. Targeting just one of those contexts, so just on the individual level or just the environmental level, is unlikely to do the trick. So out of all of these things then, how do you prioritize what to focus on? Here is a chart that lists some things to consider when you're thinking about criteria to identify priority problems on the left side of your screen, and on the right, criteria to identify the intervention that you would like to use for problems. These are all important to consider when you're choosing which problems to tackle or which solutions to implement. Okay, the next component of the logic model is resources. Again, we talked about what resources you have, and in this step, it really involves inventorying what you have and what you don't have, but that you need in order to operate your prevention efforts at your prevention program. So one thing is thinking about your resources. In particular, think about that last bullet point, partnerships, coalitions, or community sectors, as a component of your resources. Who needs to be involved in addressing these issues with you, and in what ways? Your prevention efforts will be a lot stronger if you can have broad participation. Here are some ways to think about who you might want to involve. Here's a little graphic of a campus community and the surrounding area. And these little blue boxes are all potential partners that you might want involved in your prevention efforts, depending on what your priorities are, what you've determined to be the biggest problems. And then think about what it might take to engage these potential partners. Often, again, this involves data, you having data, to make a compelling case to a targeted partner regarding how student substance abuse affects their own mission or their own role with students. Okay, so strategies, taking a look a little bit more in depth at this component of a logic model. Here you're really selecting, describing, and implementing detailed specific strategies that are going to address your identified priority problems using the resources that you have available to you. So this is what you do, with whom, and how. And this part of developing the logic model involves constructing this in some detail. It's important to describe the size or the scope of the services and the products that you intend to deliver or produce. So, for example, you want to know if a program was delivered to the intended audiences at the intended dose. For example, the number of facilitators you trained, the number of classes that you taught, the number of workshops or meetings held, how many materials did you produce and distribute, that kind of thing. In this step, you're going to decide also who you're going to reach, how many you will reach, and in what geographic area. For example, we're going to reach students in just Johnson dorm or campus-wide, for example. You might also need to think about a subpopulation if necessary, for example, Greek organizations or athletes. Here again, data is important in choosing both the geographic area and the population or the subpopulation. You also think here in this step about implementation. This is the next step. It's putting your logic model into action. So the questions to ask yourself here is, how are we going to reach our intended audience? Will we reach enough people to make a difference? Do we have an appropriate venue or way to reach people with this program? And is the intensity and duration of the intervention appropriate for the type of participant that we're targeting? That is, higher risk participants warrant higher intensities and longer durations. I think this also will not be new to you, but maybe as a reminder or review that in a prevention effort, really, you want to take a look at several levels, sometimes called the 3-in-1 framework. You want to look at individuals, including at-risk or alcohol-dependent drinkers or users. You want to take a look at the student body as a whole. And then you also want to target the college community and surrounding community. At the bottom of the slide here, you can see, and maybe most of you are familiar with this, but there is a publication called College Alcohol Intervention Matrix that I think is a pretty good tool to help you look at a number of strategies and kind of contrast them. I've got a link there to that publication, and I encourage you, if you haven't seen it, to take a look at it. Okay, the final component is outcomes. And here you're thinking about what do you expect to happen immediately as a result of your efforts. Also, what happens more intermediate. These are driven by the initial short-term changes, but these usually are maybe more directly to behavior change, whereas short-term, you're really talking about changes in knowledge, awareness, skills, attitudes, motivation. And then finally, long-term outcomes are further out on the horizon, and they're typically maybe systems change, community change, population level change. So outcomes, especially long-term outcomes, are influenced by a number of factors in the environment. So expect that multiple variables need to be targeted in order to lead to an impact on long-term outcomes. So you really want to think about kind of a multi-factored prevention approach that produces short-term outcomes, a variety of them, which therefore merge to create impact, intermediate outcomes, and then ultimately lead towards your long-term goals. All right, so we've just gone through the components of a logic model in some depth. How do you make it logical? Reading a logic model means following a chain of reasoning or if-then statements which connect the program's parts. If you do this, then you expect that this will happen. Let's walk through that. So if you're reading your logic model with all the components here, reading it from left to right, logic models describe program basics over time from planning through results. So certain resources starting at the left-hand side, after you've identified your priority problems, etc., certain resources are needed to operate your program. If you have access to them, then you can use those resources to accomplish your planned activities. Moving over to your activities, if you accomplish your planned activities, programs, efforts, then you will hopefully deliver the amount of product or services that you intended to the right people at the right time, in the right setting, in the right dose. If then you accomplish your planned activities, then your participants are going to benefit in certain ways, meaning there will be some learning that takes place. If that learning takes place, then you can expect that that learning would result in different actions or behaviors and ultimately change conditions or impact. I think also that it's very useful to read a logic model starting on the right side and starting with the end in mind. So once you have identified your priority problems and you know what your longer term results need to be, you can start on the right end of the logic model and work to the left. So if you have certain conditions you want to change for the population, then certain behaviors need to change first. So what are your intermediate outcomes that you're looking for? So then if you want those behavioral changes to occur in your population, then what do you need to do in terms of changing their knowledge or attitudes or skills? Again, moving over to the left, if you want your students or whatever your population is to develop that kind of knowledge or skill or attitude, then what programs or activities or strategies do you need to implement to specifically target and develop those kinds of learnings. Again, moving to the left, if you need to implement those programs or activities or strategies, then what kind of resources do you need to do that? So it can be helpful to work a logic model both from left to right and from right to left. And if at any point as you're reading through your logic model and the reasoning just does not follow, it could mean that one or more elements of the logic model isn't logical. It could mean that your planned work doesn't match well with your identified problems, or that you don't have resources available to accomplish what you need to do. But any disconnections that you encounter as you're working through this, revisiting the logic model is helpful for identifying where that disconnect or mistake in the chain of reasoning is happening and then addressing that. The two maybe biggest challenges that I've seen people make over years working in this field are disconnects between choosing priorities based on sound data and then choosing strategies based on the data. Sometimes people choose strategies because they're familiar with them or they like them or there's funding available for them, but they don't really match to what the data is telling you are the primary problems. And people go ahead and implement those programs that they like or are easy or there's happens to be funding available for, and it just doesn't address the problems that need to be addressed. Here then is a full logic model kind of filled out, and this is an example, an actual example of a logic model that was developed by a four-year college in Minnesota. Looking from left to right, you'll see resources, and then moving across the top row, strategies, how they're going to implement those strategies, what outcomes they can expect, and then what intermediate outcomes they can expect from each of those. And you can read through this. I'm not going to read them out loud to you, but you will have a copy of the webinar, and you can take a look at this in more detail. And you can see in terms of the strategies that there is that 3-in-1 prevention lens working not just with individuals, but also campus-wide and in the area surrounding the campus. Okay, so the last thing I want to cover here in the remaining time is how do you actually use the model. We know all the components, we know how to put it together logically and check it for logic, but what I want to encourage you to do is to use the logic model as a learning tool throughout planning, implementation, and evaluation. Don't set it aside once the model is complete. Actually use it as a learning tool. In planning, your logic model can serve as a tool to develop your strategy and enhance your ability to clearly explain, to build stakeholder and ownership, as we talked about a little bit earlier. In implementation, a logic model really forms the core for a focused management plan that you can use as a yardstick to routinely monitor fidelity to your planned implementation. And that helps you focus your energies on assuring that the program is implemented as you intended. And then using it during evaluation, the logic model really directly drives and is the cornerstone for evaluation efforts. So the goal is to use your logic model to design your evaluation and then use evaluation data as a feedback and learning tool, with the logic model initially informing the data plan, but then the data that you collect ultimately informing the model, sometimes resulting in revisions of the original model. So let's look individually just a little bit at using your logic model in these three ways. Here are things you want to think about in terms of planning, questions to ask yourself during the planning process. How do I know these are problems? For who? Which of these problems are priorities? Am I using recent sound information or data to identify these? What kind of capacity and resources do I need to address these problems? So these are all ways that you can use your logic model during planning. Again, thinking about, do I have the resources I need? Are the outcomes that I'm putting in here really within our control or sphere of reasonable influence? And are the outcomes we intend really achievable within the funding and reporting periods that are specified for our efforts? In implementation, a well-developed logic model will really direct you to what you need to keep track of and measure to monitor your implementation. So, for example, who's implementing this program, for whom, when, how many times, with what materials or curriculum, and can help you think about if program activities are not happening as planned, why not? What barriers are we coming up against? How can they be minimized or removed? Do we need to either revise the logic model to fit real limitations or barriers that we're encountering, or do we need to change how we're implementing our programs or activities to better mirror the logic model? Finally, you can use your logic model in evaluation, both to think about whether you're getting results that you plan to get, and to look at making potential adjustments to either the logic model or to the activities. So if you use your logic model in conjunction and to drive your evaluation, you're really going to have not only more effective programming, but better documentation of your outcomes and a way to share knowledge about what works and why. So in terms of outcomes, I want to say just a word about what's sometimes called process measures. So we're not concerned just with what happens as a result of our efforts. We're also concerned with what we did to achieve our intended outcomes. And we want to do this because we may have agreed that, for example, we needed a broad multi-sector effort to make this approach effective. Well, did we have that representation? Were people represented? Were they coming to most of the meetings? So monitoring the implementation in real time allows us to make midstream adjustments and achieve better efforts. A couple of things about evaluation plans connected to your logic model. These bullet points here are the things that you would want to include in your evaluation framework. And these are things, as you're developing your logic model, you want to think about evaluation then, not at the end of implementation, but before you even start implementing things is the best time to think about evaluation, because you're going to have to be doing some of these evaluation activities while you're implementing or even before you're implementing a program. It's also important to know in evaluation that whether you're measuring outcomes or whether you're collecting data on your process or what you are doing, you need the most you need the most direct evidence that you can get. You need to collect things in the same way over time. And you need to define things that you're collecting information about in the same way over time. And you need to do something that's cost effective. So all of these things are things you should think about at the beginning, so during your logic model development. Here are a couple of slides that show you, as you're thinking through evaluation, even when you're developing your logic model, the kinds of tools you can use to manage and keep track of what you're trying to do. This is an example of an outcome evaluation management matrix, and it basically lists what outcomes are we looking for, what is the data that we're using to measure that, and are we collecting that in person, pencil and paper, are we doing it online, who's going to do that, who are they collecting the information from, at what points in time, and then who's going to analyze that data, when, and how are they going to analyze it. So this really lays out everything that you need to think about at the beginning, not after your implementation or even during implementation of things, but as you're planning your prevention efforts. Similarly, here's an example of a tool you could use to manage your process evaluation, or what did we do to achieve the results. So a well-developed logic model should help you fill out this table. This is the kind of detailed information you need to think about in developing your logic model, so that you can get this information and use it. All right, if you could, let's spend just a minute here before we are done for the day. If you could type again into the questions box and just let us know what's one thing that you heard today that you feel like was new to you, or that's a nugget that you can take away from today's webinar and use in your efforts. So go ahead and just spend a minute typing that into the questions box.
Yeah, so if you could just take some time to write kind of what you'll take away from today, or what maybe you'll share with others that you.
Oh, okay. Dave, thanks for your comment. Working backwards through the logic model. New idea, maybe? Actually, I often do that, work from right to left, starting with the end in mind. And I find it very helpful. Other people. Yeah, that's a good comment, Mary. Just getting a reminder that you should pick the strategy that works the best with your data. So let the data drive the strategies, not just ones that's comfortable or convenient, or there happens to be some money available for, or what have you. Anybody else? One takeaway from today, one nugget? Oh, Dave, another good comment. Thank you. Evaluation starts at the beginning. Yeah, very important to remember. We also have let's see, taking time from Cortner. Star? Yeah. How to describe the importance of consistent evaluation procedures and data analysis to our board. Taking the time to set up something that will not be obsolete in a year. Yeah, that's really a critical point. Thanks for that comment. I'm glad that was a takeaway from today. And it's an often made mistake, and it really it carries a cost that most people find that they don't want to bear. So taking time up front to do it right really pays benefits. Okay, any final questions that you have? If there are, I think we still have a minute or two if you want to type them into the question box.
Yeah, go ahead and type any questions if you have anything that came up that you're interested in. Or if you think of something after the fact, you also can get a hold of me at IHEC, and I can relay the message to Candace as well.
Yeah, on the very first slide, also, I have my email address, and I'd be happy to be in touch with any of you if you have a question or are looking for a particular resource, anything like that. Please don't hesitate to shoot an email to me, and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can and try to help you think through whatever is your question.
Yep, and as discussed, you will get 2 handouts sent from me as well as this presentation, so you'll have all of the information. So if you got any questions, feel free to use the question box now.
All right, well, we'll keep looking at the question box for questions, but I do want to take this time to thank you for being with us on the webinar today, and to thank you for your participation in the polls and in the question box and with your comments. I know that sometimes people think about logic models, and it's kind of like selling beets to 5th graders. There's just people get kind of a bad taste in their mouth. But I wanted to work with Emma and with IHEC on this particular topic because I think it's very important to build an appetite for logic models because they provide so many benefits to you as prevention practitioners, and again are not, I hope, seen by you as just merely an oversight or accountability function, but something that can really be helpful to you. So with that, I want to thank everybody again, and again invite you to email me if you have questions or want to follow up on something. And thank you again for participating and being with us today.
Thank you, Candace. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. We really appreciate it. As well as the follow-up email that you'll get with all of the good materials, I ask that you please fill out the evaluation that you'll get in the mail or in your email as well. That will allow us to get some feedback on the presentation and help us plan for future events. So please look out for that one as well. You should get it around an hour after the presentation ends. Candace, thank you very much again. We really appreciate you working with us.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks everybody.
Thanks. Have a good day. Bye.